Every day, architects spend billions of dollars fighting a problem that arrives for free every morning: the sun. We fight it with air conditioning, high performance glass, reflective coatings, automated blinds, smart facades, complex mechanical systems. Yet, the most powerful solar technology ever invented requires no electricity, no maintenance, no software, no moving parts. It's a shadow. And for thousands of years, humans understood exactly how to design them. Ancient civilizations cooled cities without compressors, without smart buildings, without energy models. They used geometry. They studied the movement of the sun, and they designed architecture around it. Somewhere along the way, we became obsessed with glass. We wrapped buildings in transparent skins, then spent enormous amounts of energy trying to fix the problems we created. Today, many buildings have shading devices, but surprisingly few are designed scientifically. Some look sustainable, some win architectural awards, yet many perform far worse than they should. Because effective shading isn't about aesthetics, it isn't about style, it isn't even really about architecture. It's about understanding one thing: how the earth moves beneath the sun. This is the architecture of shade, and it might be the most important sustainability lesson that architecture schools rarely teach properly. Long before air conditioning existed, civilizations had already solved one of architecture's greatest challenges: heat. Travel to ancient Egypt, the Middle East, India, North Africa, the Mediterranean. You'll notice something interesting. Buildings rarely expose themselves directly to the sun. Streets become narrow, courtyards become deep, windows become recessed, walls become thick. Every decision is carefully designed to control sunlight, not because people understood thermal simulations, but because they understood observation. They noticed that shade creates comfort, and over centuries, entire architectural traditions emerged from this simple realization. In the deserts of Persia, intricate screens filtered sunlight before it entered interiors. In India, deep verandas protected buildings from intense solar radiation. In hot Mediterranean climates, arcades created continuous bands of shadow throughout the day. These weren't decorative elements, they were environmental technologies. In many ways, traditional architecture was more sophisticated in its relationship with the sun than many modern buildings. Because these buildings weren't trying to conquer nature, they were designed to cooperate with it. And that cooperation was based on a profound understanding of one invisible force: solar geometry. It's astronomy. That might sound strange, but every shadow you've ever seen is created by a relationship between three things: the earth, the sun, and time, nothing else. When architects discuss shading, they often jump immediately to devices: overhangs, fence, screens, louvers. But those are merely outcomes. The real design process begins much earlier. It begins with understanding where the sun is in the sky. At any moment, the sun occupies a specific position. That position can be described using two angles: altitude and azimuth. Solar altitude tells us how high the sun is above the horizon. Solar azimuth tells us where the sun is horizontally. Together, these two measurements determine every shadow on Earth. Every shadow cast by a tree, every shadow cast by a mountain, every shadow cast by a building. The moment architects understand this, shading stops being a design accessory and starts becoming a scientific discipline. Because now, every question becomes measurable. How far will sunlight penetrate? How deep should an overhang be? How tall should a fin become? When will direct sunlight enter a room? These questions are no longer guesses, they are geometry. Imagine you're designing a beautiful office building. The west facade overheats every afternoon, employees complain. Cooling loads increase, the building consumes more energy than expected. So you decide to add a large horizontal overhang. Problem solved. Except it isn't. The building continues overheating. Why? Because the problem was never overhead sunlight. The problem was low-angle sunlight. And this is where many shading designs fail.
Architects often think in terms of objects, but sunlight thinks in terms of angles. A shading device only works when it interrupts the path of incoming solar radiation. If the geometry doesn't match the solar angle, the device becomes almost useless. This is why some expensive shading systems perform little better than decoration. The shape exists, the shadow doesn't. And in sustainable design, only the shadow matters. To understand shading, imagine watching the sun for an entire year. In summer, the sun climbs high overhead. In winter, it travels lower across the sky. Every day it rises in the east, moves across the sky, and sets in the west. The path changes continuously. Architecture must respond to this movement. This is where horizontal shading enters the story. Horizontal overhangs are designed for high-angle sunlight. When the sun is high, a relatively small projection can block enormous amounts of solar radiation. This is why overhangs perform so well on equator-facing facades. But what happens later in the day? As the sun drops lower, sunlight begins slipping underneath. The overhang loses effectiveness, the geometry has changed, and this creates a new challenge, one that horizontal shading cannot solve. Among environmental designers, there is a facade that almost everyone fears, the west facade. Not because it receives the most sunlight, but because it receives sunlight at the worst possible time, late afternoon, when buildings have accumulated heat all day, when cooling systems are under maximum stress. The sun arrives low on the horizon, almost horizontally. At this angle, overhangs become ineffective. The sunlight simply passes beneath them. This is why architects developed vertical fins. Vertical fins don't block high-angle sunlight, they block side-angle sunlight. They intercept the solar radiation that arises from the east and west. In other words, horizontal shading controls altitude, vertical shading controls azimuth. And suddenly, the logic becomes clear. Different facades require different geometries. The sun isn't the same on every side of a building, so why should the shading be?
By the 20th century, architects faced a dilemma. Horizontal systems worked, vertical systems worked, but neither solved every solar condition. The solution was remarkable. Instead of creating a shading device, they transformed the entire facade into a machine for producing shadows. The French called it the Brise Soleil, the sunbreaker. A Brise Soleil combines multiple forms of solar control into a single system. Horizontal elements, vertical elements, screens, louvers, layers, depth. Instead of fighting one solar angle, it responds to many. The facade becomes a filter, not a barrier, not a wall, a filter, controlling light, heat, glare, views, and comfort simultaneously. This represented a major shift in architectural thinking. Buildings no longer reacted to climate, they were designed around it. Here's a question. Would you use the same shading strategy in Stockholm and Dubai? Of course not. Yet, architects frequently copy solutions across climates. A facade that performs beautifully in one region may perform terribly in another. Because shading is never universal, it is always local. Hot, arid climates require aggressive solar protection. Hot, humid climates require shade combined with ventilation. Temperate climates require balance. Cold climates may actually benefit from solar gain during winter. This means there is no perfect shading device, only appropriate responses. Good shading begins with climate analysis, not aesthetics, not trends, not facade composition. Climate first, everything else comes later. So how do architects actually design shades scientifically? The answer is surprisingly simple. They map the sun. Sun path diagrams are among the most powerful tools ever created for environmental design. They allow architects to predict where the sun will be at any time of day, any day of the year, before construction begins, before materials are selected, before facades are designed. Using these diagrams, architects can literally see sunlight before the building exists. This transforms design from intuition into evidence. Every overhang, every fin, every screen can be tested against the movement of the sun itself. The building becomes a response to reality rather than assumption, and that changes everything. Perhaps the most surprising thing about sustainable architecture is that many of its most powerful technologies are ancient: shade, ventilation, thermal mass, orientation. These ideas existed long before electricity, long before sustainability certifications, long before computers. The sun that strikes our buildings today is the same sun that illuminated ancient cities thousands of years ago. The geometry has not changed. The physics has not changed. Only our relationship with it has.
And maybe that's the lesson. Sustainable architecture is not about adding more technology, it's about understanding the forces that were already there. The best architects don't simply design buildings, they design relationships between people and climate, between form and performance, between sunlight and shadow. Because in the end, every sustainable building begins with a simple question. Not how do we cool this building, but how do we shape the shadow?